I go fast through 2 or 3 topics. First, the tidal volume. So this is the data gathered from recent randomized trials on mechanical ventilation. And then we have here the frequency distribution of tidal volume used plateau pressures used in these trials. And as so I put everything together, protective approaches, conventional approaches, and we see that the majority of the patients were using 28 of plateau pressures in these trials. And then we just stratified the patients according to quartiles, and then there was an effect of plateau pressure on mortality. It was clear, higher plateau pressures, higher mortality. And this was not related to the severity of disease because patients with low compliance or high compliance presented the same effect. This is their summary. So plateau pressures, the numbers here are, we don't have the x-axis which is cut, but here you have approximately 40 centimeters of water of plateau pressure, so the risk of death increased. We did the same for tidal volumes, and the same type of analysis revealed that tidal volume was not a primary drive for mortality in these patients. And based on the physiological background behind the transpulmonary pressures, the concepts of that Gattinoni was talking today about the chest wall compliance, looks like the tidal volume is a much far away from the primary drive, which is transpulmonary pressure, than plateau pressure. Plateau pressure is closer. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's a drive that is closer to transpulmonary pressure. Therefore, at the bedside, I pay attention to plateau pressures. The usual range of tidal volume is 4 to 8, like Bob Kaczmarek suggested, and then I pay a lot of attention on plateau pressure. As a practical rule, every patient has to be below 30. When I have a fat patient, I think about 35. We talked about recruiting maneuvers. We proposed this protocol. I would like just to call attention that hemodynamic problems changed. Hemodynamic problems occurred in our first attempts. And later on we learned that putting a little bit more of volume in those patients made a big difference. And today we like to use the pulse pressure before the recruiting maneuvers as an assessment of the volemic status of the patient. So whenever an interesting detail, the pulse pressure is pretty much dependent on the tidal volume or the delta pressure you are using. When you're using low tidal volume ventilation, very low tidal volume, you don't have too much pulse pressure difference. Because pulse pressure is the variation in the pulse pressure, the difference between systolic and diastolic pressures according to breaths. And if your tidal volume is small, you have very small changes. So all the studies validating the pulse pressure were using 10 ml per kilogram of tidal volume. So you have to use a reasonably high delta pressure. I suggest you 20 centimeters of water, which is something very reasonable. We have had this experience. So we use a delta pressure of 20, and then you measure the pulse pressure. If this variation is more than 13%, as suggested by the original papers from Michael Pinsky and many others, and then this suggests that your system is empty. You need more volume. You give volume when you don't see any more variations in the systolic pressure according to the breaths. It's a good signal that your patient is ready for your recruiting maneuver. Last point. I think everyone today was saying something bad about the inflection point, and since we were responsible, or we were proposing this approach many years ago, I think it's important for me to explain why we also quit this approach. And so, first of all, our hope 5 years ago, much more than this, I would say almost 10 years ago, was that by looking at the inflection point on the PV curve, we would be finding the opening pressures of a patient, and then, as shown in many physiological studies, we would be very close to the closing pressures. So we are not that, let's say, stupid at that time. So we knew that we were talking about opening pressures. But our hope was that the opening pressures would be a good surrogate of the closing pressures. So in this case, this was a nice patient, so we have a good matching between opening and closing pressures. But later on, performing a large series of patients, we couldn't find a good correlation. So it means that really the inflection point is dependent on so many variables and has a so indirect relationship with the closing pressures that you cannot rely on its value to find the ideal PEEP. So we prefer the decremental approach as suggested by Kaczmarek. The only detail that I would like to call attention is that we like to start with high levels of PEEP because we found a big number of patients with closing pressures above 20 centimeters of water. So we like to test these high numbers. And just as a remark, this is the closing pressure detected by CT. Okay, you can't see the number here, but it's 20 centimeters of water. This is the best compliance in our patients. You see? So the best compliance was achieved when we had almost 20% of collapse in those patients. So I'm talking about this because Fernando, this morning, Fernando Suarez showed a very nice study on pigs. And in this study, the best compliance coincided very well with this point, or reasonably well. In patients with ARDS, for some reason, this is not the case. But at least at midnight, or when you cannot perform a CT, you don't have time to perform an oxygenation trial, I always suggest to my residents to measure the best compliance in decremental PEEP steps. Why? Because you can never be below this. Maybe in some patients you are underestimating the right PEEP level, but being below the best compliance, I think there is no reason for this. Because think about compliance means the delta pressure you are applying in the system is certainly the mechanical stress you are applying in the lung is somehow related to the mechanical stress. So I would never allow the PEEP level to be below. Thank you very much.